Good evening, everyone. And I will start with a quick introduction. So, my name is Abhimanyu. I am one of the co-founder at InterviewBit, and we are very fortunate. And thanks a lot, Bhavin, to do this session for our students and everyone here today. Bhavin has been a serial entrepreneur. I think the introduction is not really needed, but Bhavin has founded a series of extremely high impact, multi-billion dollar businesses. Currently, he runs Zeta and Flock. So, Bhavin, I will maybe also talk about a little bit of your early journey. So, at 22, you had bootstrapped 5 successful businesses, and one of the core belief has been that it's an obligation to do what potential you have. It's an obligation to build businesses up to the potential you have. So that is very inspirational. I can also talk about how we have known Bhavin over time. So since we were in college, me and Anshuman, both of us doing our engineering, Bhavin has been a role model since then. Anshuman actually did internship back in 2009 at DirectI, and been always very inspired by you, Bhavin. So probably over to you. Bhavin, do you want to maybe share with everyone things that you want to cover today?
Thank you for all the kind wishes. So awesome. So Abhimanyu, thanks for the introduction, and really appreciate you guys kind of setting this up and having me join this. My goal and objective was, well, one, you've collected a series of questions from various people who are participating in the CMA. And folks, by the way, if you want to add to the question list, you can visit slido.com and put in the code scale up, SCALEUP. So that's Slido, SLIDO.com, and the code is scale up. You can really ask your questions there. I thought I'll take, only about 10 minutes to first kind of deliver a sort of a small presentation on one of the topics that's dear to my heart that I think will be useful and relevant to people. And then after, I would love to make this session, I guess, as interactive as I possibly can, given that it's like a one-sided stream. But respond to sort of and answer questions that all of you folks have asked on Slido. All right, let me just quickly share my screen. Awesome, perfect. All right, so I'll take about 10 minutes and run through this presentation, and then we'll, as I said, dive into Q&A. And feel free to add as many questions. I'm happy to answer pretty much anything. I'm an open book and more than happy to kind of, provide advice in areas that I can actually provide advice to all of you guys. So this is a small presentation on this notion of reframing failure. I've been a serial entrepreneur now for about 22, 23 years. I started my first company, co-founded along with my younger brother when I was 17. And since then have been part of 4 or 5 different companies, each kind of a success in its different space and industry. I've always been an entrepreneur, so I've never really taken a job in my life. And in many ways, this was from the very beginning, I always sort of believed this is what I want to do. I found my passion early on. And a lot of people sometimes sort of ask me, I guess different times I get asked this question on, sort of talk about your reasons for success and things like that. And I guess this is one of the topics that I thought I'd present to you guys, this whole notion of reframing failure and the entrepreneurial mindset and kind of difference that I've found within, in the way I think about the notion of failure and the way entrepreneurs or successful entrepreneurs that I've met think about the notion of failure versus generally the term failure as we kind of know about it in the language. In fact, I think for many years, I guess I used to always believe that the word failure kind of didn't exist in my dictionary, and I would always sort of proclaim it that way. But I think most people don't really kind of relate to that because truly the word failure does exist in the dictionary. And I think when I started thinking about it a bit more, I realized this notion that actually entrepreneurs, it's not that the word failure doesn't exist in our dictionary. It's that entrepreneurs actually think about failure in a very different way in comparison to, in comparison to the general world. And I guess it's meant to kind of run through this sort of mindset of reframing failure, right? It's interesting as a quick sort of anecdote. Even the word failure, I remember reading this in one of the books that I came across called The American History or History of America or something like that, where it's interesting the word failure until about 50, 70 years ago, the word failure used to denote a failed event. And in many ways over the last many decades, many times we kind of end up taking this word so personally, right? We actually end up deeming we actually, instead of just an event that has occurred, we actually end up deeming an individual to be a failure. And we started using this word for actually people when the dictionary meaning of this word was never intended to be attributed to a person. I mean, a person is never a failure. The word failure's definition by itself does not mean a person. And yet sometimes we end up taking things personally ourselves. We end up viewing ourselves as a failure or somebody else as a failure. And I guess that's another sort of important element in this whole notion of reframing the notion of failure, basically, right? And so I thought I'd start this presentation with actually the dictionary definitions of these antonyms as we think of them, which is, the word success. And if you look up the definition of the word success in the dictionary, it says the accomplishment of an aim or a purpose. And it's quite interesting, actually, if you look at the definition of the word failure, it actually uses success. It says lack of success is failure, which I guess, seems fairly obvious that that's the way they would define it. But it's quite interesting. So it's sort of, success is the accomplishment of some purpose and failure is, lack of success. So I want to actually run you guys through kind of, 4 different bullet points in terms of the way, well, I and other sort of successful entrepreneur friends of mine have always thought about failure, and hopefully end the presentation with giving you a very different perspective on what failure would mean, right? So let's start off with this sort of example, right? Is this failure? Somebody who is sort of dropped out of college. There might be some amongst you who were sort of either thinking about or have done that, yourself in some form. Somebody who's dropped out of college, was fired as a senior leader, a senior tech executive, was sort of an unsuccessful, businessman, for quite some time. Would this, by the general definition that we look at, anybody would look at this sort of mini biography and say, oh, well, this person seems to be a failure, these events seem to be a failure, etc. And yet this is actually the story of Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs actually dropped out of college. He was fired from the very company that he founded by the very CEO that he hired in 1985. So he actually ran Apple for some time, brought in John Scully from Pepsi as the new CEO, and then was fired in 1985 in some sort of this coup between John Scully and the board. And then after that, he founded Next Computers, which most of us probably don't know about because it wasn't really very successful until eventually Next, 11 years later, was bought back by Apple. And then Steve Jobs went ahead and built some of the best products that we all use on a daily basis in the world. And so it's interesting when you think about each of these individual events, one would assume that they're failures and the individual has certainly kind of failed. But this is the story of one of the most successful people that we know, right? Similarly, let's talk about another sort of anecdote. Is this failure? Somebody who kind of went bankrupt twice, got ousted as a CEO of the company, and got fired again while he was on his honeymoon. And so this again, if you look at sort of read through the events, they all seem like failures on the part of an individual. But this is again the story of Elon Musk, who started Zip2 in the late 90s and then got ousted as a CEO in 96. He then started PayPal. He was actually kicked out of PayPal while he was on his honeymoon in 2000. In 2008, actually, if you've read his biography, Tesla and SpaceX both went almost bankrupt. They literally were both on the verge of bankruptcy, right? Even today, actually, there are people, especially in the last 1 year or so, Tesla still continues to be among the most shorted stocks in the world. And there's still a lot of people betting on the fact that he might actually fail or that his companies might fail. But again, kind of trying to illustrate the point that when you look at these individual events, they might appear as failures, and the individual, if I didn't tell you guys sort of who the story was about, would appear to have kind of failed in many ways. And what this really brings us to this first bullet point is actually failure is nothing but a stepping stone in many ways. If you look at the stories of whether it's Steve Jobs, whether it's Elon Musk, or any successful entrepreneur, you'll find they've had to go through this journey multiple times until they eventually, our definition or the general conventional definition succeeded. And in many ways, failure was just a series of stepping stones along the way. So that's kind of the first bullet point that I wanted to talk about. That brings me to kind of bullet point number 2. And here I'll share kind of a pretty popular anecdote. This is about Edison, who invented the light bulb amongst many other things, presumably. And this is kind of a snippet from one of the books that was written by one of his assistants, where he actually talks about the process of going through, depending on which story you read, anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 different filaments before he found tungsten as the filament that actually works, and that actually managed to successfully build a light bulb. But during that course, so his assistant Walter sort of asked him that isn't it a shame that the amount of effort that you've put in and the amount of work that you've done, because he hadn't succeeded as yet, you put in so much effort and work and you haven't yet been able to get any results. And I love this perspective that Edison shares quickly in retort is like, why I've actually got a lot of results. I know several thousand things that won't work. And a lot of people forget this, that failing at something is also an outcome, because now you know a path or an approach that actually doesn't work. One of my favorite quotes is a quote by Michael Jordan, where he says, I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've actually been trusted to take the winning shot of the game and missed. And he kind of ends the quote by saying, I've failed over and over and over again, and that is why I succeed. And this really sort of illustrates the same point that in every failed outcome, there's actually a lesson to be learned. Every single failure increases the odds of success, and this is kind of mathematically also fairly easily demonstrable. I mean, let's assume that there are, I don't know, 10 ways to do something, and you try 5 of them, and all 5, there are 10 different ways that you could possibly do something. You try 5 of them, and those 5 didn't work. Well, for every way that you chose that didn't work, there are now lesser ways that you need to try to actually get to success. And so every time you fail, you're reducing the possibility set, if you will. And therefore, every single failure is an opportunity to learn and mathematically improve the odds of success. So that's kind of the second bullet point that I wanted to leave you guys with. So let's talk about bullet number 3. We in the tech industry, this is always a commonly asked question: is why is the Valley so successful? You've got this 40 square mile radius, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and the Bay Area. Why is it that so many of the innovations and large sort of tech companies that have been successful globally have sort of come out of this space? And I actually attended this interesting presentation in Stanford by the professor of entrepreneurship there, and he talks about this subject and says, in the Valley you have easy access to capital, you have amazing sort of availability in terms of talent, you have all these sort of factors that clearly are instrumental to success in many ways. But then he kind of ends his presentation with what he says is the most important factor. I really sort of love what he said. He says that in the Valley we have learned how to celebrate failure, and you'll find in the startup ecosystem there'll be entrepreneurs in San Francisco and the Bay Area who failed once, twice, thrice, and they'll still find venture capital firms that are willing to back them, probably even more so in some cases, because they now have gained a significant amount of experience, potentially tried a bunch of stuff that doesn't work. And so in many ways, the Valley's always celebrated failure. In fact, it's quite interesting actually in our industry. If you think about the Valley, if you think about the startup ecosystem and the tech world, we actually came up with a completely different word, different vocabulary for it, right? So startups actually don't even call it failure anymore. We call it pivot. So we don't really fail, we just pivot. And it's such an interesting sort of transformation or reframing, right? You've worked on this business idea and it didn't work out. So you haven't failed. You actually pivot to a different form of that idea or a different structure, a different format. And there's so many companies in the Valley that have actually been successful. I've done that on a number of occasions where you've gone down a particular path, it didn't work, and then you kind of pivoted. There are no failures there. In this sort of ecosystem, there's just sort of experiences and your reactions to them. And that kind of brings me to this third bullet point, which is that we should all learn how to embrace failure and celebrate failure. And that's really the entrepreneurial kind of way of thinking about failure. And that brings me to the last bullet point that I want to kind of share with you guys. I don't think I can stream a video through this video, but I'll sort of paraphrase the quote that I want to talk about. So this slide essentially shows one of my favorite movies, Lord of the Rings. This is the Two Towers, the part where actually Frodo and Sam are obviously along the journey to Mordor. And Frodo's in a state where he sort of almost wants to give up, and he's really like, Sam, I can't go on. And Sam, in all his sort of wisdom, has this monologue which kind of ends with this, this quote that he says. It's like in all those great stories, the ones that really mattered. Folk in those stories had lots and lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going, and we've all kind of experienced this in many ways, right? We've all sort of, as children, grew up and have read and listened to and heard these sort of fables and fairy tales and stories from our parents and from books that we read back then. And it's always interesting that every fun story or great story, the ones that really matter, the ones that stuck with you, you'll find this common theme. The hero or the protagonist or the people in those stories had lots and lots of chances of turning back, and the only difference is that they didn't. It wouldn't really make for a great story if a prince decided to save a princess and tried a couple of times, said this is not working out, and then went back, right? That wouldn't really make for a great story. And so the stories that really mattered, the difference between those stories, the difference between those individuals in this case, versus the ones where the story doesn't matter, is that everybody goes through this journey and they have lots and lots of chances of turning back, of giving up. And the difference between somebody who succeeds and somebody who doesn't is the ones who succeed kept going at all points in time, right? And this brings me to kind of an interesting thought, which is that you technically cannot fail if you don't give up. So you at the point you give up, that's when you fail. If you haven't given up, you're still along that journey. And so failure is literally it's just an event. You move on. You continue from there, learn the lessons you're supposed to learn, and sort of move on. So if I put all of this together, if I take all these sort of anecdotes and stories and bullet points together and put them in a single sentence, in many ways it sort of reads like this, right? Failure is a milestone on the journey to mastery. It's kind of an event. It's kind of a milestone. You learn from it, you embrace it, and you move on. So the interesting thing is that if I take away the word failure in the same sentence, what's the other word that actually perfectly substitutes the same exact sentence and works, reads the same way, and that's actually success. If you think about it, success is also a milestone on the journey to mastery. You learn from it, you embrace it, and you move on. And so it's interesting. We kind of started this presentation with this sort of definition of success and failure, which there were kind of the opposites of each other. And when you really think about reframing failure, the way I've laid it out, the way sort of most entrepreneurs think about it, you realize that actually failure and success are no different from one another. They're both milestones on the journey, on the purpose that you're trying to achieve. And you learn from them, you embrace them, and you kind of move on. And that's sort of what I want to share with you guys as a quick presentation before I dive into the AMA session. So happy to answer any questions about this. Also, feel free to, as I said, add them on Slido. And Abhimanyu, we can actually now switch to the Q&A. I hope that was clear. As I said, I get no feedback during the course of this monologue, so I'm hoping that people were actually able to hear me clearly.
Yeah. No, but so I'm seeing a lot of comments, and of course, thanks a lot for this. I can also personally relate with a lot of things that you said. Typically, if I just talk about the journey of having started InterviewBit, we have been running it for almost 5 years now. Of course, have been a lot of setbacks, failures, but the only thing that kept us going is staying at fixing a problem for long enough. That's the most important lesson that I have personally learned, that if you just stay on it, solving something for long enough, eventually you will solve it. So thanks a lot. Very insightful inputs from you, Bhaven. I will add in the question stream now. So here we have, of course, there are a truckload of questions which people had asked. As of now, I see almost 800 people, 800 people watching you live across different channels. So on the questions, maybe I think we can start taking the questions in the order of upvotes.
So I can start off if you want me to jump right in. I'll read out the questions and then read out and then try and attempt to provide some advice to the extent that I can. So awesome. So guys, again, the Scaler InterviewBit team is going to set up this Slido account. So if you want to ask a question, just visit this URL, slido.com, and enter this code, scale up, and you will be able to ask your own questions or vote on existing questions. So it's already asked out there. As when you said, I think there's already a plethora of questions out there. So I'll start off with the first questions from Nikhil. Thank you, Nikhil, for asking this question. So how do you decide whether any idea is worth pursuing or not? And how do you deal with existing competition in the market if you want to enter that segment? Well, I guess that's two separate questions. So I'll talk about, each of these. So firstly, I have, ideas are dime a dozen. I've always believed that execution, and you'll see this time and again as an entrepreneur, if you actually really start your own company, a lot of people sometimes try to guard their idea thinking, oh, I have a precious idea, but you'll find that vast majority of success is actually dependent on the execution, not really on the idea. And so in many ways, as I said, ideas are dime a dozen. Many people can have them, and really how you execute on it sort of makes the difference. The framework the question you're asking about is how do you figure out whether an idea is worth pursuing or not? And I can maybe share a framework with you, which we use internally. I've been part of multiple startups in the course of my journey. So the framework that we use internally to kind of really decide whether an idea is worth pursuing or not. And in most cases, when you're trying to make this decision of whether an idea is worth pursuing or not, it's actually a decision of, I have these, at least for us, it's I have these 3 or 5 different ideas. Which one of them is worth pursuing the most, for instance, right? And so to me, an idea is kind of the very beginning. What you really want actually to decide whether you pursue it or not is a business plan. And I think of a business plan as comprising essentially of 5 components, which is a target persona. So you always want to start with who are you addressing this business or product or solution towards, who's the exact target persona, individual, company, what is their size, what are their demographics, etc. So you're starting with a target persona. What's the problem that this target persona has that you're trying to solve? So if you're building, let's take Slido for instance example, your target persona is sort of exhibitions or trade shows, etc., and you're trying to solve this problem of collecting questions. So what's the problem you're trying to solve? How is that problem being solved today, and how's your product? So that's the third element is your product. So how's your product, let's say 10x better than the existing solution? If people have this problem since a while, there's already some sort of solutions that exist out there. So how is it that your solution or your product is sort of substantially better? So what's your product? It's not just sufficient to have a product. So your fourth element is your what we call GTM or go-to-market strategy. How is it that you're actually going to acquire customers? Because you might have a great, target persona problem and product, but if there's no way to actually get to that target persona, get your message out there and get customers, you don't really have a business. So you need a go-to-market strategy. How are you going to make revenue? Whilst in many instances in the startup world, sometimes revenue has been pretty elusive. At least historically, I've always focused on businesses that are revenue positive as early on as possible. And I functionally believe that that if your product doesn't generate revenue, if your customers are not willing to pay you in some form for your product, then you've probably not even achieved product market fit. Because truly, if people meaningfully achieve value from your product, then there would be an ability to generate revenue from it. So what's your revenue model or profit model? And the last one, and this one sort of a lot of people sort of tend to forget, is what's your moat? So you might have a target persona, a problem, a product, go-to-market strategy. So I guess the sixth item, revenue plan. But if it's a product that anybody can easily copy, and if it's customer based, that's going to be very fickle, and they can easily switch from one provider to another, and you have no lock-in into that base, then again, you don't have a sustainable business model. So target persona, problem, product, go-to-market strategy, revenue, and moat. And when you actually really sit down and think about all of these, draft out your business plan, that's when your idea becomes a true business. And if you can validate all of these, if you can validate that the target persona you're looking at has the problem that you identified, the product actually meaningfully solves it, and not just meaningfully solves it, the marginal increment benefit is 10x better or 5x better than existing solutions. You have an ability to sort of be able to easily get to this target audience through a low CAC and high LTV, and potentially generate revenue from them. And your business itself has a moat. The moat could be data. The moat could be sort of integrations. The moat could be network effect or whatever it is. Then basically you have a business plan and not just an idea anymore. So yeah, that's the framework that you can use to, I guess, evaluate whether an idea is worth pursuing. For your second question, how do you deal with existing competition? I guess there's probably several answers to this question, but one of the things I've always seen lots and lots of companies do successfully. We've kind of done that successfully. The moment you see there's competition in an area, narrow your focus. You can narrow your focus by target audience, by vertical, by industry. So there might already be a product, let's say email. There's already a product out there, been out there for 25 years, and everybody in the world has been using email. Well, if I wanted to build a amazing email product, I would just narrow my focus. Maybe I build the most outstanding email experience for sales professionals and start with that niche, because nobody's addressing that niche. So every time you see that there's competition in the market, you want to define a narrower focus and a niche that you can enter into, that will basically give you a start and give you sort of a unique brand positioning in that particular market. All right, moving on to the next question. What is the one advice? This comes from Amit Trajit. What is the one advice you wish someone told you earlier when you started as a new grad engineer in your first job? I'm sorry to disappoint. I had no first job, by the way. My first ever sort of career path, right, while I was in college, was actually my first company. And and so I don't necessarily know the experience. I've never actually given an interview in my life, never had a resume in my life. But I do have perspective. I have spent a vast majority of my time interviewing people, freshers and laterals likewise. And so I'll talk about a couple of quick points in terms of career advice in general. The first one I'll talk about is choose a career in something you would gladly do for free. Nobody had to pay me money to code. I started coding when I was 10 years old, and I found my passion early on, and that's why I started sort of multiple tech companies after that. But it was never about the money. It was nobody had to actually pay me money. I love, there's this again really beautiful Steve Jobs quote where he says, choose a career in life that you can't kind of wait for the sun to rise the next day to sort of do it all over again. And that's the way you want to think. That's the way you want to feel about the area that you pursue, which is choose something you gladly do for free. Passion is what drives success. The second advice I will give you, so I guess you asked for one piece, but I'll at least talk about 2 or 3 things. One is, the second thing I'll tell you is surround yourselves with smartest people, especially if this is the first job that you're going to take up. I would always optimize for smart people solving challenging problems as opposed to money. Always optimize for future value, and future value is a function of growth of knowledge. So monetary growth and money is a side effect of knowledge growth and value creation. Your focus should be what is going to maximize my knowledge and what's going to maximize my ability to create value. And if you maximize those two, you automatically maximize monetary outcomes and career growth and all the other stuff. Those are all side effects. So surround yourselves with smartest people and focus on growing your knowledge. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to, I guess, the next question. This is kind of similar. What career growth advice would you like to give to a fresher who is just starting his career and wishes to reach top position in the company in the future? Well, I mean, I guess all those sort of previous things that I said apply. I would say one of the things I've actually seen in the IT space, in the tech space, it's kind of unique to India in many ways, is that people end up becoming specialists in one platform, and then they always want to spend their life on that platform. So India's got a lot of like back-end engineers and front-end engineers and web developers and so on and so forth, and or mobile developers. And I find a lot of people sometimes are either afraid to because they think it won't result in career growth, or they think they won't be able to do it, to kind of go broad. So I strongly believe in going deep. And by the way, you should. So you start out with a particular area and definitely go as deep as possible. But I strongly believe that your growth after a certain point in time will plateau if you also don't have depth in other areas. If you simply know only everything about backend or everything about databases, but don't know enough about front end, you're not going to be able to actually grow into kind of leadership roles, into architect roles, etc. So I guess one of the growth advice that I would talk about is go deep, but then also go broad. And that would kind of help you grow. Yeah. All right. Move on to the next question from Preeti. So Bhavin, currently I'm confused whether to try the 4 FAANG companies and then work on my idea, so Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc., and build my own company, or just start working on my idea right away. So I guess I'll say 2 things here. One, there is no one success formula. There are enough number of examples of successful entrepreneurs. So you shouldn't be confused about this. There are enough number of successful entrepreneurs who've either directly started out on their own, literally in college, right after college. There are enough number of successful entrepreneurs who've worked in companies and gained experience over time and then built their own company. So there's really no one success formula. Whichever path appeals to you more, I guess what you need to do, and that's the second thing I guess I can add to this, is what you need to do is you need to kind of think through the trade-offs, basically. So on the one hand, when you find a opportunity in a great company with brilliant people, etc., you will actually learn really fast. You'll get to learn at the cost of that company. You'll gain experience from that organization and smart people around you. But you'll be spending your time on problems that they want to solve and not problems that you want to solve. So you'll learn a lot about org structure, platforms, technologies, but not necessarily about the industry and space that you are passionate about. Sometimes you can get a combination of both, and that's sort of ideal. Whereas if you're going to start out on your own, you may not really have those many mentors and people who can advise you. But then you get the opportunity to kind of sort of immediately start working on the scope of the industry or the area that you're passionate about. So I guess you have to decide the trade-off basically from your side. But as I said, there's no one sort of path to success. The next question. So, is there a group where tech leaders like you share and discuss good books? So I'm happy to actually have a blog post that you guys can. I can actually share the link of these. So I'm an avid reader. Of a large chunk of sort of my success has been a result of. I still tend to read about 2-3 books every month or more if I can. And I was fortunate enough to sort of have this habit instilled into me at a very, very early age, just sort of reading a lot. But I have a blog post somewhere on sort of the thousands of books that I've read, the top few books that have actually paved my way to success. Abhimanyu, I'm actually going to send you a link to that post, and you can actually post it as a comment to the forum or whatever. There are a bunch of YouTube videos that I can also share separately at some point in time. But independently, I guess I'm not personally part of specific groups, but there are lots of sort of online angel forums and things like that you can definitely sort of participate in to learn more and read more. And this book list that I've shared is certainly a good starting point. All right, so next question. Know about your success, but I'm sure it must not be an easy ride to get to this point in life. Please share your low points in life and how you face them. Again, a very good question. Thank you for asking this. And this happens a lot with entrepreneurs in general, which is that we tend to always read about their success. For the most part, media tends to glamorize all the kind of growing valuations, etc. And for the most part, people don't realize. In fact, I would strongly recommend, by the way, reading both the biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson and the biography of Elon Musk amongst many others. They are sort of hugely inspiring on, like, you really get to see how they've had their kind of low points in life. And I can almost certainly sort of bet that there haven't been almost any examples of successful entrepreneurs that haven't gone through sort of their own series of ups and downs. I guess I can talk about, same sort of applies to me. I've had series of mistakes that I've made in my life. Some of the worst mistakes I've made have actually been product management mistakes, for instance, where I had an amazing idea and I thought everybody in the world would want this product, and I built out these products, and eventually nobody wanted it and they failed, and we had to kind of shut down those divisions. It's happened not just once but multiple times, over and over and over again. And I guess the couple of things I'll say in many ways, this whole sort of presentation that I delivered at the beginning of this talk on reframing failure has been very important to me. From the very beginning in life, I've always treated failure as a stepping stone. I've always treated. I love this word. In the presentation I talk about this word mastery, and I love this notion of mastery versus success, because success is kind of like a binary outcome. You either succeed or fail, and then that's it. At that point in time, you sort of succeeded in some sense, and you've reached the end of that outcome. But the word mastery is so much more relevant to entrepreneurship, because it denotes a lifetime journey. Right? You could be pursuing mastery in any subject or in any field of work for your entire lifetime and never reach the end. And the notion of mastery automatically assumes success and failure as milestones throughout that journey. So I always think of, I guess, even entrepreneurship much like, I guess there's this analogy of investing in shares. If any of you kind of invest in the stock market, if you start looking at your share prices, if I've sort of bought, I don't know, 1,000 shares of Google, if I look at the share price every single day or every single minute, it can actually be quite depressing, because it'll keep going up and down, etc. And there'll be all this volatility. But as long as the general trend is upwards, you will always have these constant deviations. And if you recognize those deviations, you learn from them and you move on. You basically continue to ensure that the curve, when you sort of take a step back and look at the entire curve, you'll see the gradient is always moving upwards. And so in many ways, I think that attitude is certainly helpful. Not getting hugely attached with the outcome, but rather focusing on the purpose. One of my other favorite authors is this guy called Simon Sinek. He's got an amazing TED talk that you guys should definitely see. And he's written this amazing book called Start With Why. And it talks entirely about, identify your purpose. What is it you're trying to do? And if you have a purpose in life and you're following and pursuing that purpose, then failure and all the other elements are irrelevant, because you can continue to pursue that purpose and have some ups and downs along the way. So I guess those are a couple of things I can talk about. Yeah. Let's move on to the next question. This is about my favorite topic, OKRs. So you've been a great advocate for OKRs. Do you make personal OKRs as well? Code quality versus shipping speed, thoughts, frugality in business. Oh, that's a lot of questions. I don't make personal OKRs, by the way. I've been using OKRs as a tool. In fact, by the way, somebody asked me, one of the things that I would have taught as a tool or framework to my younger self 20 years ago when I started my first company, I think my very first tool or framework would be OKRs, so objectives and key results. It's actually by far been one of the most instrumental tools for my success. And I think it has substantially improved the way our organization sort of, in terms of focus, alignment, priority, and really sort of getting the entire organization moving in one direction towards things that matter. So I've actually got a set of training videos on the internet on OKRs that we use internally. I've kind of made them all public. So if you sort of search for them on YouTube, you should be able to find them. And as I said, we use them as a tool in our organization. Like, even if it took us 3 to 4 quarters to kind of get them reasonably right, and I would say we still do sort of an 80% job of getting them perfect. But even if you start off and implement them to 50% perfection, you'll actually immediately start seeing benefits of implementing OKRs in your organization. Code quality versus shipping speed. What are my thoughts? I would say that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive if you kind of use the right tools and frameworks these days. But the notion of, I guess I can talk about from a business perspective. The notion of starting out in a business is you always start out with sort of a thin slice and build your MVP first, your minimum viable product. And at that point in time, you will sort of cut corners and thin slice and build sort of the smaller slice, and may not necessarily focus as much on quality, because once you've validated stuff externally, you always have time to kind of go back and improve the quality. So I would say your primary focus should be on getting stuff out there as fast as possible in front of your customers, so that you can get early feedback and validation and keep iterating based on that validation. At some point, if the code quality is becoming an issue to be able to just take the next steps, then that's when you address it. It doesn't mean you write lousy code to start with. You should at least practice your standard processes in terms of writing code as well as you can. But your ideal goal should always be to get product out there in front of customers as soon as possible. Frugality in business, I think, is extremely important. Is one of the talks that I give is all about this notion of how overfunding can actually kill businesses in many circumstances. And the reason I've seen that happen invariably is that with a lot of cash, people end up substituting creativity with cash. When you have a lot of money, you don't have to be creative. Creativity actually thrives in adversity. And so to that extent, if you have limited resources, you're forced to be creative. If you have unlimited resources, you can just throw cash at a problem. And then that becomes the company culture. If you keep throwing cash at a problem, you're not creating a company that is learning how to be creative along the way. And so that's what I would sort of talk about when you sort of think of frugality in business. Lessons learned from Direct Eye's first product. Oh, some people actually know that, so before I started, before Div and I started our sort of hosting company, I built this product that was actually similar to, I guess, like Monster.com and Naukri and so on and so forth, which was intended to be an automated job matching engine. So you would enable a large number of candidates to be able to find jobs and a large number of companies and placement agencies to be able to find candidates. And this is actually one of the, as I was saying earlier, I've made lots of mistakes in my life. So I spent about a year building this product, trying to sell it. It was complete disaster. Nobody really actually paid for it except for a small handful of clients. And really the fundamental reason for that was I'd actually built a product that was way ahead of its time. There were about 40, 50,000 internet connections back in 95, 96, in terms of number of users across the country that were really actively using the internet. And so this entire engine would require hundreds of thousands of people to be using it to actually make it effective. So if I really thought about it in hindsight, the product was never going to be successful, but I actually didn't spend time validating stuff, and I built this out. That's why it was an amazing idea. So I think the key lesson learned is two lessons. One, you can be ahead of your time, and it's not always good. In fact, in many cases in our industry, you'd be surprised to find that it's actually bad to be ahead of your time. Facebook wasn't the first social network. Google Chrome wasn't the first, browser. A vast majority of the successes in our industry, you will find actually that there have been other companies that have tried it before, but they were probably too ahead of their time. And the second lesson that I think that was most important that I learned was validate early on. Get your product out there in front of customers as soon as possible. Okay, next question. How do you sell your vision to people whom you want to onboard for a new project idea or when you want to hire someone good? So, I think the biggest weapon that startups and early stage startups have in their arsenal is actually selling people on a vision, because vast majority of really amazing people that are working in large companies unfortunately don't have the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in those companies because they're just one small gear in a massive machine. But as a part of startup, they might have the opportunity to make a meaningful impact, to be able to really drive purpose, to be able to wear multiple hats and so on and so forth. So all these advantages. I think it's important. So I'll again go back to sort of Simon Sinek and start with why. If you have a purpose, you should start a company or an idea or a sort of a follow a path because you have a purpose, because you're trying to achieve something. And if you have a purpose, then that story itself is, people rally around purpose and people rally around other people. And so if you can articulate that purpose in a meaningful way, you'll always find that there's always other people in the world that have the same purpose, that have the same passion about that particular direction, and will more than happily join you. And then over time, if you build a really amazing team, then people also rally around people. And so it's always easy to find more A players to join you if you already have an amazing team of A players. All right. So the next question, I guess the question is, should we join MNCs like Amazon or a nice startup? And where do you think we can grow? I would say again that I think companies like Amazon and Facebook have their advantages, etc., and startups have their advantages. And I would go back to, I guess, the 2-3 things that I mentioned before in career advice. Surround yourselves with the smartest people. So if you're joining Amazon, try and learn more about the opportunity and who are the people you're going to be working with. If you're joining a startup, read up on those people and try and figure out, who are you, going to be working with. Surround yourself with smartest people. As much, earlier in your career, I think that's the most important thing. The more smarter people you surround yourselves with earlier in your career, the sort of more sort of better growth trajectory you'll have in your career. And then I guess also join organizations where you're passionate about the problem that they're trying to solve. So I think those would be the 2 pieces of advice that I would give out here. Next question, would you recommend IB Academy to your employees? And if so, what would be your expectations from them after the course? I must admit that I'm not necessarily fully qualified to answer this. I personally haven't kind of reviewed in detail the course at IB Academy. I have, of course, however, interacted with people, both who've designed the course, the founding team and others, and some folks who have actually sort of gone through it and gone through stuff that IB's done in the past. And I think that it's amazing. I personally, love kind of aligning myself with education as a cause through, Coach Chef and also sort of to the extent that I can help, Abhimanyu and Anshuman and the IB team to kind of achieve their goals and objectives. I think, back in 2007, I myself was really frustrated about the quality of engineering talent that we produce, and not the quality of the people, but the quality of the output that we can produce, largely because the fact that there weren't enough resources in our engineering institutions and colleges to actually prepare us to the extent that we need to really be able to solve challenging problems, meaningful problems out there. And so to the extent companies like IB Academy, Coach Chef, and many others that are kind of doing this sort of trying to solve for the gap, I would strongly recommend it to both students and professionals to actually leverage as a tool. The next question: what is your why? So I guess I would answer this in a couple of different parts. One, as an individual, I think what's driven me throughout my life is I've always personally very strongly believed that each of us has a moral obligation to make an impact that's proportionate to our potential. Like, all of us have this amazing gift of a life, and we should all be able to look back at the end of our life and say, well, my entire life made a meaningful difference. And so that's something that's always driven me throughout my life across all the kind of business ventures and all the other projects that I'm a part of. And then independently, I guess if I think of each of my companies, with Zeta, I guess our vision and goal is to accelerate to a world of invisible payments. We strongly believe that payments should be invisible, and so our tagline is payments with purpose. We think that nobody wakes up in the morning to sort of excited saying that, oh, I'm super excited, I have to make 5 payments today. Nobody's excited about making payments. They have payments are a means to an end. And so one of our sort of our mission statement or our vision is to sort of accelerate the world to invisible payments and really manifest purpose through payments. And so that's kind of the why for Zeta. With Flock, our why is, I personally am very, very passionate about productivity. With Flock, our goal objective is to empower individuals with tools and software, individuals and teams with tools and software that make them more efficient and productive and enable them to maximize their potential. So yeah, so both personally as well as for each of my companies, I guess that's what drives us. So the next one, do you advise a fresher to start his career with machine learning, or should they go into web development first? Again, to be honest, there's no right answer. Both of them are sort of fair amount of potential. Whatever you're passionate about, whatever you think you can adequately address in the near term, etc. And nothing prevents you from jumping from one to the other also in the future. So I would say start with whatever you're passionate about first. Next question. Do you have any specific checkpoints that you check while hiring, especially for freshers? So I'll talk about general checkpoints that we check for while hiring, and then maybe talk a little bit about checkpoints for freshers, general traits that we look for. We're looking for people who are smart, people who get things done and are really passionate and driven, and people who are humble. We think these are the 3 most important traits when hiring anybody. Somebody who's smart, can solve problems. We don't really necessarily care about specific knowledge, especially when we're looking at freshers. But people who are smart can solve pretty much any problem. They can apply themselves to any problem. People who are passionate and driven will actually work towards solving problems and work towards kind of achieving outcomes. And then I've always believed fundamentally that humility is the most important trait you need to consistently grow in terms of knowledge. So yeah, I think those are the 3 kind of traits that we would look for. In terms of checkpoints, I think with freshers, we tend to actually focus pretty heavily on algorithmic skill sets, because in many ways, as I said, specific programming languages and things can change, but people who have their fundamentals strong in terms of data structures, algorithms, generally understanding the fundamentals of computing, etc., will be able to kind of meaningfully solve for any problems in any space. So I think those are the things that we look for when we look at freshers. The next question: what are some of the traits of top performing engineers in your opinion? I guess I kind of covered that in some sense already in the previous question. So I'll kind of skip that one. All right, the next one is: why has India not dominated in the tech space and created quality companies when we have so much talent? How do you suggest to help solve this problem? This has been actually an interesting area. For me, as I said, I started as an entrepreneur pretty early in life, and for the longest period of time, India has actually ended up being a service-oriented organization. We have millions of software engineers, but we've actually ended up becoming the outsourced software development shop for the better part of the first 2 decades of sort of tech and IT. That's changing a lot now. In the last 5-7 years, I have seen a huge amount of amazing quality of tech companies come from, originate from India, and I think I'm really, really happy about sort of the kind of products we're seeing sort of built out from here. I would say I think the one suggestion I would have is that India today, even though we're a billion people, if you really look at it from an economic standpoint, you'll find that India is not really the biggest market in terms of revenue potential. Our GDP per capita is amongst the lowest in the world, or fairly low. Number of people who can kind of afford to pay for products, etc., in comparison to some of the more developed markets like North America, UK, Europe, etc., is much lower. And that's actually one of the reasons why we've always pioneered, I, my brother, some of the companies that we've started, some of the companies that I'm running right now, we've always pioneered in the process of running a global company. So our customers and revenue come from countries all around the world. In fact, a large chunk of it comes from, developed markets. A lot of our product engineering talent is leveraged in India, where we think there is really amazing tech talent that's available. And so I guess that kind of ends up being the best of both worlds. And I'm seeing that trend with a lot of B2B SaaS companies, which are building products in India, just like us, and then selling them to a global audience. All right. Next question is, what is the difference between the perspective of engineer and entrepreneur, and what does it take for a good engineer to become a successful entrepreneur? This is actually sometimes I feel that an engineering mindset has both pros and cons in terms of becoming a successful entrepreneur. On the one side, I think that that engineering is a philosophy. Always, all engineers typically have this tendency of thinking from first principles, and I think that's hugely important. I've seen vast majority of sort of successful ideas, not just in building a product, but in marketing, in sales and business development, come from this ability to think from first principles, the ability to sort of think, in abstracted concepts, etc. And so I think that's definitely an advantage of being an engineer. I think on the flip side, we also have many disadvantages because, as engineers, we know the possibilities. And so engineers always in many cases, get tempted by this sort of flawed assumption of if you build it, they'll come. Like all of us have interesting product ideas and we're like, oh yeah, we can build this amazing product. And I'm going to code it in the next, few months and everybody's going to want it. And there's always this fallacy in assuming that, if you build a product, people will want it. And so, to an engineer, basically you look at a nail and you build a hammer. But if you look at an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur starts by saying, well, why did the customer want the nail in the first place? What is he trying to achieve with that nail? Is he trying to hang a picture? Is he trying to fix furniture? And depending on what the individual is trying to do, the solution that you build may be very different. So I guess that's the one kind of big difference between, engineers and entrepreneurs, which is that, we always immediately jump to sort of the solution space without thinking a lot about the problem space. And successful entrepreneurs are engineers who can start by thinking about the problem space. What is it that the target persona is trying to do? And then, use that to kind of build a successful product. The next question is story behind the build up to a big decision that you took and what influenced it. And what was one failure you eventually overcame? What did you change to overcome it? I guess I can combine all of this in some sense. So, obviously we take big decisions all the time. And I'll start by talking about sort of the failure and the changes aspects. Basically, some of the biggest decisions we take are around building a completely new product or, jumping into a completely new business segment or target persona segment or things like that. And most of our biggest failures have come by virtue of jumping straight into what is a hypothesis and building it out and pushing it out there versus taking enough time to gather data, talk to people, and validate your hypothesis. And so, I made this mistake early on in life. The first very product that I built back in '96, I made this mistake, 10 times over between then and now. And historically, essentially what I've improved on a consistent basis is to constantly, well, both myself and the team as a whole, to ask the question or, do we actually have data or have we gathered enough data to validate this hypothesis? If you have an idea, go out there and talk to people, build just wireframes if you need to, put in some fake ads on Facebook or Google to see if people are interested in it and go click on it. Like really start gathering feedback as early as possible to validate your hypothesis before you kind of build it out. And so if you look at now some of the big decisions that we take, as I said, we spend a lot of time validating our hypothesis and collecting data, secondary and primary research, and gathering information that will substantiate and validate, any decision that we're taking. The next question, I guess in some sense a follow on, but do you start working on an idea only after you're sure that it will result in a success? I can tell you for a fact that nobody can do this unless you have a crystal ball. You can never be sure that an idea will result in success. Otherwise, technically there would be no failure for us. And so I think I would say we start working on an idea or working on a business after we have spent sufficient effort in validating our hypothesis and we have enough data to get subjective level of conviction that our hypothesis is valid. It still doesn't mean a result in success, because just a valid hypothesis, success is a function of, as I said, revenue, price, competition, go-to-market strategy, reception by customers, retention. There's so many different factors, and so you can't guarantee success, but you can increase the odds and the probability by doing as much validation upfront at every single step along the way. And then I guess I'll take the last question. There is so much buzz about AI, ML. Lots of investments are put into pure AI startups. Why have you not invested or created one? Well, I guess, in some of the stuff that we're doing in Zeta and Flock, touches upon ML and AI. But, for me, I don't start a business because I want to, or I don't invest in a product because I want to attach myself to the latest buzzword. I've always believed that frustration is the genesis of entrepreneurship. And so each and every idea or each and every company that I've started has been an area that I'm passionate about because I saw a problem in the world. We started Zeta, me and Ramki, in 2014 because we strongly believe that payments are broken. The fact that cash exists in the world is an anomaly, and it's frustrating. And so you see a problem, and then you figure out how you want to fix that problem because nobody else is working on it, and what do you want to do to solve it. And then you figure out what tools you need. And so if AI and ML happen to be the best tools, then we'll invest behind those. If something else happens to be the best tool to solve that problem, we'll invest behind those. So chasing buzzwords is not really, you need to be passionate about the problem space you're operating in, not necessarily about the technology or tool. Today it's AI and ML. These days not even sort of machine learning. People talk about deep learning. Tomorrow it'll be something else. And so the tools will keep changing. The purpose that you're pursuing, in most cases, tends to be a long-term bet. Awesome.
Bhavin, if I may request for just one question that I wanted to ask.
Of course. Clearly, your question didn't get upvoted.
So the question I wanted to ask is that what would you call as one problem that you see definitely needs fixing? You would like to fix it, but you probably because of not having enough bandwidth. And maybe if someone fixes it, then you would love to maybe invest in it or mentor them. What would be one such problem?
For sure. And this is not in any ways to, by the way, inflate your ego whatsoever. But I honestly believe that education has huge potential. It has huge potential to make an impact for individuals across the world. It has huge potential in terms of using technology. We've only just begun scratching the surface on leveraging technology to meaningfully solve for education. And I've always fundamentally believed that pretty much all other problems in the world can be solved if you solve for education. And as I said, we still have a long way to go. We have a long way to go in terms of providing access to everybody. We have a long way to go in terms of providing all the relevant content to everybody. We have a long way to go in terms of solving for inclinations. Or it's like education as a space, I think, has a really, and I personally am sort of supremely passionate about it, and would love to continue investing my time and effort behind that also in some form or the other. But it's definitely a space I would sort of strongly, strongly affirm as a space that people can pursue.
Thanks a lot, Bhavin. And already, like you doing this session, that's already like very thankful for making that investment. I really believe that a lot of people who might be watching this right now, this might be very impactful and life-changing inputs. Quite a few things which otherwise seem obvious to us once we have understood it. But before that, a lot of things that you said today, I wish I had access to this content when I was just graduating. So thanks a lot for doing this session, Bhavin. Really appreciate it. Probably when I myself, as of today, cannot fully understand the value of this, sharing this content with a lot of younger engineers in today's generation. So thanks a lot for that.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who participated and joined, even though I couldn't see any of you, but I could see the sort of questions constantly popping in. And I'm sorry I couldn't give justice to all of the questions, but really enjoyed sharing this time with all of you guys.
Thanks, Romain. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night, guys.